Here again, this is the third time I think I've spoken to the association, and the first two times we're on World War topics. Today we're looking at World War I and some recent research which I have been doing, and we're going to talk about that. I usually like to get a feel for the audience before I start. Do we have any Americans in the audience? No? Oh, good, I can make some rude remarks about the United States. That's a good start. Any Kiwis here? Oh, great. I feel like it. I can crack some New Zealand Kiwi jokes. But we probably won't have time for that. Now, here we have what I'm going to talk about is the historiographical context. What that simply means is how are historians looking at this particular situation. Now, it's pointed out to me in the last few days that an Australian military historian by the name of Leah Hampton, who is pretty well known, is talking to the Western Front Association in the UK on Zoom at the end of March. This is what she is saying. Now, I don't know what she will actually say in terms of her speech. But I just draw your attention to the last bit. We'll look at where it all could have easily gone wrong. Yeah, no problems there. When commanding officers, including Monash himself, made terrible decisions that cost lives and jeopardised the advance itself. Okay, I'm going to suggest to you, and I'm prejudging what she's going to say, I'm going to suggest that a lot of what she says will be related to what I'm talking about today. The use by Monash of the Americans. Now, this is the context for, just as we might accuse Monash supporters of using hyperbole, I'd suggest this is pretty close to hyperbole itself. And for that, if you like, gross exaggeration. I cannot look at any part of any of the commanders of the Australians in that 100 days and say someone made a terrible decision. Someone made military decisions which sometimes didn't come off. That I think is obvious. That doesn't make it a terrible decision. Okay, so we're going to look today at Doughboys under diggers, and as my friend Ron Lyons pointed out, what a delightfully appropriate title for the end of Mardi Gras. But it was never meant like that. And I'm sure my friend Rob here never meant it in that sort of context. So context is everything. When you're looking at Australian military history, a lot of it is about how bad Monash really was. I wish I was as bad as he was in my military career, or even civilian career. Okay, we're going to look at, therefore, at those American formations which came under the command of Australians, in particular under Monash's command as this part of the Australian Corps. Quick, being a school teacher, quick question, how many divisions in the Australian Corps during the 100 days? No, you know, just five. All right, so thanks for the Dorothy. 5 Australian divisions, but Monash commanded, in fact, 12 plus divisions during the 100 days. Remember that the Australian divisions are not the only part of the Australian Corps. Remember, of course, that most of the artillery is supplied by Britain. Most of the gunners are British. There are Australian units, yes. There's an awful lot of British soldiers attached to the Australian Corps. Okay, so here we have the US 2nd Corps headquarters, which we'll come back to that in a moment. The 27th Infantry Division, nicknamed Orion's Roughnecks, the New York National Guard. The 30th Infantry Division, nicknamed Old Hickory. And if you go to the Hindenburg line at, I think, Rickvale, you will find a memorial to the 30th Division on how they actually won the battle of the Hindenburg line. North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee and Georgia National Guard. And finally, the 33rd Infantry Division, the Prairie Division from the Illinois National Guard. And, I'll add in there, the 301st Heavy Tank Battalion, which operates British Mark V and Mark V Stars, and which is actually not part of the US 2nd Corps, it's part of the US 2nd Tank Brigade, okay, but was assigned to the US 2nd Corps. Well, actually assigned to the 4th Army. The 4th Army thought that the best place for the American Tank Battalion was with the Americans. Funny about that. Okay, and here are the divisional insignia, 27th and the 30th. Incidentally, that's the World War I insignia, and it's on its side. They corrected that in World War II, so they turned it 90 degrees. And the 33rd. I need to point out, before anyone searches in the history book, Monash did not command the 33rd Divisional Headquarters, nor either of the 65th or 66th Brigade Headquarters. What he had were the regiments of that division under his command. Okay, so let's have a quick think about the American Army, which we know, of course, won the First World War. If actually bother to read American stuff. Its commander is General John J. Pershing, selected because he was regarded as being politically correct. Now, I'm not having a go at him, I'm simply saying the other option, General Wood, was regarded as actually having political pretensions and therefore could not be, because he was a Republican, could not be selected to command by a Democratic president. Pershing was seen as apolitical and therefore was selected. He's also, to be blunt, the only general officer with field experience at that time. War was declared 6th of April 1917, and at that time the Americans had just one active division in their regular army, and that active division consisted of regular units and National Guard units. It had no more than about 350,000 soldiers all up. And it's going to go from that figure to over 3 million by the end of the war. By war's end, over 2 million of those people are in France. And the final thing, half were transported by Britain. The American army doesn't get to France if Britain doesn't transport it. By January of 1918, the Americans had managed to get 6 divisions to France. That is in 9 months. If you extrapolate that across, they're barely going to have any sort of combat potential by the end of 1918. And in one sense, from everybody's perspective, that doesn't particularly matter. The war is not ending in 1918. Only fools like Douglas Haig and Marshall Ferdinand Foch think that it might end in 1918. Okay. So, here we are, the American forces, and this is what historians and what Australian historians constantly go back to. They are only to serve under American command. They might train in foreign forces, but not operate with them. And this is the instructions from the Secretary of State. In military operations against the, Secretary of Defence, in military operations against the Imperial German government, you are directed to cooperate with the forces of other countries employed against the enemy, but in doing so, the underlying idea must be kept in view that the forces of the United States are separate and distinct component of the combined forces, the identity of which must be preserved. This fundamental rule is subject to such minor exceptions in particular circumstances as your judgment may approve, you will exercise full discretion in determining the manner of cooperation. Now, that's the only instructions that Pershing gets. And unfortunately, without looking at any other historical events, historians, and particularly Australian historians, keep going back to that and saying that's the benchmark. Right, we're going to have a look. Okay, what does that actually mean? First of all, a picture of Newton Baker, who's now regarded as one of the ultimate racists in America, because he was the one who insisted that black regiments have to be completely black, and there's no integration across the situation. And that leads to some interesting things. So let's have a look at what Pershing actually believed was happening. And again, let me take you back to context. It is critically important to understand at each point in the decision-making process, we know what was the context in which they were making that decision. Right? So Pershing believed that by the spring of 1918, that is now, March 1918, would see the Germans outnumber the Allies 260 divisions to 169. America should be able to field 24 divisions by June, which on the current transportation rate they were never going to achieve, simply to stop the Allies being beaten. Second part of the context, it was a received fact that the Allies were in danger of being beaten in 1918 and the British Army might have to be evacuated from France. Britain and the War Office in Britain had plans to evacuate the British Army from France as a result of a defeat by the Germans unilaterally, just as they had done at Dunkirk. Right? So that's the mental state that people are in early, right through until July 1918. The British Army may need to be evacuated. One of the reasons why there is actually a block put on sending too many reinforcements to France, because you might have to bring them all back and you might have to rebuild the British Army in England, and therefore we don't need to be sending out so many reinforcements. Now, everyone conveniently forgets about that, because we look purely at what Haig might be doing, not at what people think he should be doing back in England. Third point about Pershing, the Allies basically had the wrong tactics to beat the Germans. Open warfare was the doctrine that should be followed, and America would lead the way in teaching the Allies how to fight the war. There's a famous story about Major Philip Christensen, who actually goes on to be being a four-star general. He has been a lieutenant in the field since 1915. He's risen to the rank of major. He's just finished a stint acting in command of his battalion. He comes and he talks in late 1917 to a group of American officers, and he talks them through what's going on, the state of the war, some of the techniques you might need to use. At the end of that particular speech, an American colonel stands up and says, "Thank you, Major Christensen, for coming and talking to us. It's no great, you've spent some time with us." And then he turns to the audience and says, "The British and the French have been trying this rubbish for 4 years and that ain't worked yet." What I'm getting across to you is that Pershing's views have percolated all the way down. It's baggage which is carried by every American commander and every American soldier. But they know better. Now, in one sense you could say, well, he's probably right, but maybe he's, you know. So here's the person himself, John J. Pershing. Okay, but there are now 3 game changes I want to draw to your attention. This is what changes the whole picture. Sorry?
Yeah, look, quick question. Could you explain the doctrine of open water?
All right. I have some slides on it later.
Oh.
But basically, no. It's We ask it, we'll put it up. One, the doctrine is vague. And I won't have time today to do everything about this, but put it this way, it says that the American soldier has high morale, is basically a good moral person with a rifle and bayonet, and the right training will be able to flush the enemy out of his trenches and beat them in the open fields. In many ways, it is dangerously close to the French doctrine of Lt-Col of 1914. Under that, you do not need machine guns, you do not need artillery, you just need well-trained, well-motivated soldiers, and the Americans are better than anyone else in the war. Can you see that that's a fairly dangerous situation to be in? But all American soldiers and commanders are carrying that at the back of their minds. We could go into where all this has come from. It actually goes back to what we were looking at the last month, the American Civil War, except for some reason the American staff colleges refused to see the siege of Petersburg as atypical of the Civil War. Right? What was typical was Sherman's cavalry raid. Now you don't have forces, we know that, but you can do it with foot soldiers. That's what your war should be about, open warfare. It wasn't a well thought out process. You can't point to a book that details it chapters and verse. Okay, so first of all, the transportation of forces agreement. I pointed out to you the Americans simply could not get to the wall. They didn't have the shipping. Who had the shipping? The British had the shipping. And so there was an agreement that if the Americans were prepared to give the, and we'll cut short the discussion, but it ended up being 6 divisions of infantry, minus the artillery, and some support services. If you give that to Britain, and they will train behind British lines using British equipment and will be available in emergencies to be soldiers for the British Army, we will guarantee that we will take shipping off transporting food and resources, and we will ship your soldiers to France.
How did they get from America to the UK?
This is by shipping. This is from America to France.
The British brought them from the United States.
From the United States to France. Okay, and 50%, that is over 1 million US soldiers, travelled on British shipping to France. Okay, and remember that that's more significant even in the first 6 months of 1918 because the Americans are frantically building merchant shipping, so that by the end they're probably taking 55-60% of the cargoes of human flesh across. But at the start, the British are probably doing 60-65% of the transport. And they're getting people there. So that's something that people ignore. Okay, there is an agreement. If you like, it's your joining fee of the war. You want to join the war? This is what we need from you. So it's a subscription, if you like. See it in that sort of terms. The Americans believed the British would renege when they got their soldiers. In fact, it was the opposite. The Americans who tried to renege on the deal once, and the British just kept going, transporting Americans. And the Americans actually put 10 divisions into the scheme. Because, why? Because Britain was supplying all the equipment. Okay? These guys, in fact, the divisions we're talking about fighting with the Australians are carrying 303 rifles, not Springfields. They're using Lewis guns, Vickers guns. They're not using American equipment. The second one is the Doughboys Conference, 26th of March 1918. Most people probably know that, but this conference was held to basically coordinate the Allied effort. The Germans had broken through the British Fifth Army. They would be stopped, but it was a very near-run thing. And at last they sat down and they agreed to an Allied commander. Marshal Ferdinand Foch would take over as, if you like, Supreme Allied Commander in France. British government thought this was fantastic because it put Haig underneath the control of someone, but in reality it gave Haig much more freedom because he could say when the British politician said, you've got to do this, sorry, you'll have to talk to my boss about that. But it's important because what it does, it identifies these American divisions, these 10 divisions, and said these are Allied assets. They're not American assets, they're Allied assets. And they come under the command of Foch. Now, the Americans presumed that Foch would do the right thing and just hand them back to the American army. And, yeah?
David, just wanted to mention that an American division was almost twice the size.
Yes, we will get to that, but yeah, you're quite right. Okay, and the third game changer is the Battle of Amiens, and you'll see why a little bit later. But basically, remember what I said? The only people who thought the war might end in 1918 were Foch, Haig, probably the French and British Army commanders. I'm not even sure Monash really knew that was what the intention was. And I'd suggest King George V knew a lot more about the war than the British Prime Minister, because he actually asked the right questions and didn't make assumptions. Just a quick one, General Sir William Robertson, the only person in the British Army to rise from private to field marshal during his career. He had a Yorkshire accent that you could cut with a chainsaw, and was the person who negotiated the transport agreement, and that's quite something if you think about it. So let's have a look at who these people were. And there are the US divisions: 4, 27, 28, 30, 33, 35, 77, 78, 80 and 82 were all the divisions there. Now they're all equipped, they all belong to the Second Corps, because the Second Corps was formed simply to stop the British misusing those American divisions and provide a block and there. It's a bureaucratic organisation. And well, sometime in August someone said you better put these people in the field. You imagine the Corps Commander, he's been the admin Corps Commander, and suddenly someone's saying you're now going to have to go into action. There's a frantic scramble to develop all the support mechanisms that the Corps and the field needs. The only American equipment that people are using, of course, is this gun, this Hotchkiss gun, 37mm. There was a platoon in each regiment of 3 guns. It's if you like, think of it as a glorified M79 grenade launcher. It has a maximum, it fires a 1-pound shell over about 1,200 yards. In reality, I'd suggest in trench warfare, you're talking 400 to 600 yards as an effective range. It should have been a very useful piece of equipment. For some reason, it seems to have had no real effect on the battlefield whatsoever. Partly, I suggest, because the Americans were very poor at coordinating their support units. And many of these support units were wandering about the battlefield and ended up under the command of Australian platoon commanders, battalion commanders, and so on, and in the battles. Because no one, those who have service background will know, you're going out with your MFC or the FO, the company commanders got them by the scruff of the neck. Where you go, the MFC goes. So one hand you've got your radio operator, on the other hand you're hanging onto the MFC, or your CSM's hanging onto the MFC. Not so with the Americans. If they weren't integral to the unit, no one saw any reason that they should be worrying about where this. If the support has been assigned to you, it's the support's problem to be with you. So if you lose them, that's their problem, not your problem. Okay, let's put this up.
Going back to that 37mm gun, from my own research on the document, it appears that they just didn't believe that the 37mm shell had enough explosive capability to have an effect, so they just didn't bother with it.
You may well be right, because I can't find, while I can find some areas where 37mm, say an NCO was wounded, I can't find anywhere where someone talks about using it. I can't find anywhere where any of them were given decorations, which means that they were not actually in the fight. They were there, but not actually up in the fight. Which, if you think about it, is pretty criminal. When you've actually got something, you run into a machine gun post, you ought to be able to get some shots from 37mm into them. It should give you an edge. Didn't seem to do that. Okay, here we've got King George V, probably after the Battle of Hamel, decorating an American soldier. Notice he's carrying a 303 rifle. So, you look at these units, no US artillery units are provided, even though they managed to pack them on the ship. They're kept with the American Expeditionary Force, equipped with French equipment, because you don't want to be fighting with the British if you can avoid it. American unit organisations will prevail, we'll talk about that in a minute. British are responsible for training resources, the Americans are responsible for training doctrine. It's made very clear. The British would provide the equipment, the rangers, the NCOs to teach, but the actual use of the doctrine was American. And this is how British observers at the end of the training of these divisions assessed the Americans. Men were excellent. NCOs poor to very poor, as a general rule. Now, I can point out to you a number of NCOs, I'm going to do that, who actually were decorated, were highly effective, but across the spectrum, US NCOs were not particularly good at their jobs. And we're not expected in many ways because of the American training system. You gave someone a rank because they were a senior soldier, not because you wanted them to do something. The officers were good, if you've got them. American staff work is generally very poor. Remember, this is what Monash is going to have to deal with when he comes in, and a lot of it, he is assuming he's getting a British trained division which is going to function like a British division, even if its organisation is different. So, the US gave a square division, which is very similar to the French division of 1914. 2 brigades, each commanded by brigadier generals. Each brigade has 2 regiments, each commanded by a colonel. Each regiment has 3 battalions, notionally commanded by a major, but often commanded just by a captain. There are some implications of this. Now the next slide shows you roughly what it looks like. Unfortunately this is the 1940 version. There are some units on there which you won't find in 1918, but you can see the infantry brigade, and what it roughly looks like. And the divisions, even with their infantry, are much bigger. 27 Division goes into the Hindenburg line, about 18,000 strong. The 30th Division probably has about 23,000. There's usually about 7,000 in the artillery and so on. They do not have any cavalry. Someone told the Americans cavalry was useless on the Western Front. Now you might say, well, that's fairly obvious, isn't it? The answer is no. Each British Corps had a mounted regiment. Those mounted regiments were pretty critical, not just for charging with sabres and that sort of thing, but they did all your operational traffic control once you crossed the start line. They were effectively the actual run. They ran the road, they ran the prisoner of war collection points. They ran the message service. You wanted to send a message from divisional headquarters to brigade headquarters. You tasked a trooper of the 13th Light Horse to go and do it. And their machine gunners, remember they had Hotchkiss machine guns, their machine gun sections were assigned as anti-aircraft sections for each brigade headquarters. Okay, now, we did talk before about this, so quick flight here are some comments made by Pershing about open warfare. It's my opinion, victory could not be won by a costly process of attrition, but must be won by driving the enemy out of the open and engaging him in a war of movement. That sounds pretty good. Sounds almost Monash stuff, but it's not. It's quite the opposite. The rifle and the bayonet are the principal weapons of the infantry soldier. He'll be trained to a high degree of skill as marksman on the target range and in field training. An aggressive spirit must be developed. Until a soldier feels himself as a bayonet fighter invincible in battle. That's what open warfare is about. Quite different to Monash's. It's not the job of the infantry to bash against undefeated defences. When the German successes in 1918, they made this assessment. The intelligent initiative of the junior officers and the superiority of rifle fire, the Americans have inherent qualities in both these respects superior to the Germans. Nothing to do with German artillery or tactics. It was all about the superiority of the rifleman and his rifle and bayonet. The infantry shall retain the ability to drive the enemy from his trenches and by the same tactics, marksmanship, defeat him in the open. That's what open warfare is about. And just to add to the matter, 1917, the infantry drill instructions that year relegated the machine gun to emergency use only. It wasn't terribly useful. At Belleau Wood, the American 2nd Brigade, which is a Marine brigade, went without any artillery preparation and no machine guns and was cut down. At the end of the battle, the American Expeditionary Headquarters issued an instruction that said the battle had shown that the rifleman with his accurate rifle fire and bayonet was still the chief weapon on the battlefield. Simple refusal to learn anything from what had actually happened. So, what did them think was happening? I mean those people who are other than the people I mentioned. 25th of July, I remember that until this time, Britain's been prepared to Scarborough, get on the ships and go home. That's the planning in the War Office. Don't get too worried about that. You might have to come home. 25th of July, Henry Wilson, who's the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, issues a memorandum where he says he hopes he's not being overly optimistic, but he thinks we've turned the corner, and that he's optimistic that the decisive phase of the war will start in 1919, mid-1919. He said, I know there are some people on my staff who think it'll be 1920 before this finishes, but I think I'm really optimistic that we can get something underway by mid-1919. Now, that's not just words, that's the way that everybody is thinking, all the way down to except the commanders I've mentioned. 22nd of September, Milner, who's been and seen Haig, writes to Wilson and says he thinks he's failed to get inside Haig's head. Haig thinks he's going to win the war. He thinks he's going to knock the Hindenburg line out. He's got to be stopped. We should move to sack him now. He's too successful. We need to sack him because he's not following the plan. And I've got to say, I'm sorry, but I think bureaucracy is sometimes like that. You might be successful, you didn't follow the plan, you have to go. Winston Churchill visits Haig the following day, 22nd of September, and he said, Churchill writes in his diary, he said, I spent a lot of time telling him, okay, Sir Douglas, by mid-next year I'm going to be able to give you 4,000 additional tanks, some of which will be Mark 8s. I'm going to give you 5,000 aircraft, I'm going to give you so many thousand guns, so much ammunition. And he said, I was gobsmacked. Haig just said quietly, I think we might be finished before then. He said, none of this has ever been discussed in Cabinet. We've been talking about a long war going to 1920. We've been talking about maybe we might have to evacuate the British Army. Here's Haig telling me we're going to win it this year. So, and finally, just to Pershing is in the same mould. I don't have to be worrying about it. Now I've got enough divisions here to stop the Germans winning. We're going to go to war in 1919. I need to train my officers. So he removes 129 officers from the 27th and 30th Divisions, which is going to be a critical error. But Pershing doesn't realise that. Why? Because his mindset says no major offences before 1919. Okay? He's not in the same loop but Haig and Fockering. He's the junior commander. And no one's bothered to tell him, or if I have told him, he hasn't accepted that's what's happening. So we should have a look at some of the people on the left. We have Lord Milner, and on the right we have Sir Henry Wilson, often called the arch intriguer. He should have been Chief of Staff of the British Army in 1914, but was ruled out because he was heavily involved in the Koran Mutiny of 1913. But nevertheless, was a Francophile, believed very much what the French said should be fine, but was regarded as a bit of, in fact, Haig called him that windbag. There was no great love lost with a lot of the British Army senior generals and Wilson. He saw himself perhaps as replacing Haig at some point. Another person who knows nothing about the war is our friend, the Australian Prime Minister, Billy Hughes. On the left is Charles Bean. I'm not sure whether Charles Bean really understood where the war was at. And I say that honestly, I'm not sure whether he understood where the war was at or whether he accepted what he was being told that the war would finish in 1919. I suspect that Bean really didn't know. He doesn't reveal his thoughts, but what does Hughes do? Hughes tells Monash that the Australian Corps must be out of the line by the 15th of October or he will sack him. Now why? Because Hughes has been told by the British Cabinet categorically there will be no resolution in the war until mid-1919 at the earliest. Right? And so here how politics is now driving military decisions. Now, if you had not done that, it is entirely possible that the Australian Corps could have come out of the line after Mons and Quentin, been arrested for 3 or 4 weeks and put back as a 5-division force to take the Hindenburg line proper. But I'm quite sure that Rawlinson and Haig were petrified if they did that, Hughes would step in and say they can't go back in. Why? Not because Hughes was concerned about the Australian soldier. He was, but sort of his real concern was we need to be there as a fighting force at the end of the war. If I allow Monash to run the force out by the end of 1918, I won't get a chance to stand up at the peace conference and say my piece. That's where politics is going. We haven't got to the Americans yet. Hughes, by the way, Geoffrey Searle described the sort of carry-on by Bean and by Murdoch and some of the others as the singular most outrageous misuse by journalists of their position in the history of Australia. The attempt to unseat Monash at numerous points along the way, because he was a Jew and therefore was inappropriate to be in command of the Australian force. Billy Hughes, of course, knew everything about the military because he had spent 18 months as a private in the Royal Berkshire Regiment in about 1885, and therefore no one could tell him anything about the war. He also went round, he addressed groups of soldiers without any officers being there. He told them if they had any problems with any of their officers or anything that was happening, write to him personally and he would correct it. I think that's pretty outrageous. Brigadier, would you suggest that you'd be happy with a politician doing that?
Absolutely not.
No, but that's what Monash has to put up with. And this sort of thing is driving decisions. Now, it's going to drive the decisions about the Americans. Okay, so the US Second Corps is established to make sure the British don't misuse those American divisions that they have and do everything they can to obstruct Britain. But of course, we now come to Hamel, where we first meet the Americans coming down to be trained. A lot of people, historians, keep telling us that Monash is misusing them, that Hamel was unimportant, that Pershing ordered their withdrawal because they weren't supposed to be there training with the British. That's all rubbish. There's a reason for what happened. We'll look at it in a moment. What do we end up with? Well, the elements of the 131st and 132nd Infantry Regiment, 66th Brigade, 33rd Infantry Division. Originally there would be 10 companies. I'm cutting short the story here because we're skating over things. That was reduced to 4 when Pershing said, oh no you don't, get them out. But because of the way they had arrived, Pershing hadn't realised there were already 4 companies there. And when he did, he issued an instruction saying they've got to come out too. And that was the afternoon of the 3rd of July. And Monash said, oh no you don't, you can't be doing that. These guys are integrated. And so, what's the story? The story which we are told, and repeatedly by many Australian historians, Pershing did not want the Americans serving in foreign forces. That's not quite right. They were serving there, and we're going to see that the 65th Brigade came down and was actually in the trenches, taking casualties, working with the Australians in the weeks after Hamel. One of the American engineer regiments, I think the 102nd, had been working with the Australians since mid-June, taking casualties, actually in field work. The second thing we often hear with the Americans are not particularly useful or effective. Okay? Monash, therefore, was not justified in complaining about the American withdrawal. So is that all there is to it? Well, why does Pershing withdraw? It's not just about being American soldiers, it's what he is actually told. Remember, he's working from the basis there is going to be no offensive until 1919. That's a given. So therefore, yes, train my soldiers, yes, they can operate in the frontline trenches, but I don't want them wasting their time and their lives on minor inconsequential operations. What's he told about Hamel? He is told by the American Corps commander that it's some raid, or some sort of a raid by the Australians. So, not only that, the current jargon for that was, it's a stunt. Now, if you're responsible for people's lives and someone tells you it's a minor raid, it's a stunt, are you going to be very happy about having these people under command? The answer is surely no. No one bothers to tell him what it's about. Why? Because we don't want Henry Wilson back in the War Office getting a nose of what is really happening here. What's really happening at Hamel is the demonstration of the concept. If Hamel works, then we can plan it on a bigger scale. If it doesn't work, there will be no assault in 1918. Now, the other thing to realise is all the Australians tend to be very narrowly on Hamel. The Americans have fought at Katini, 5 divisions worth, at the end of May. They have fought at Belleau Wood in June. In 2 weeks' time after the Hamel, they're going to fight in the Battle of Soissons. Why is that okay? Because it's painted as we're going to have to clear this salient. We want to push this back. Hamel seems too minor to be a training accident, it's a training exercise, and too large, or not large enough to be a clearing of a salient. Therefore, I don't want them involved. It's not about John Monash is misusing these troops. It's about what I think they're doing and the context in it. And you've got to keep that context in mind. Secondly, just remember that the initial US force was 2,000 infantry. There are only, 8,000 Australians involved and things, so they're close to 25% of the assault force. They're not just coming for the ride, right? They are integrated in the plan. In fact, I've got a very impassioned diary note from an American company commander who says, I don't know how this is going to work. We've been pulled out by Pershing. He said all my people were briefed on what their jobs was. Now other troops are having to come in and do the job we were doing without a proper briefing, without a proper reconnaissance of the ground. So these people are fully integrated. But we just start with a quick look at the divisional commander, General George Bell, Major General George Bell. Have a look at there, and you can see that what we end up with all 4 companies, these are 200 strong. Theoretically, something like 40% of them are taken out and sent back as a reserve. Sounds good. I can't find anywhere in the documents that say that actually happened. I know that was the plan. I don't think once they got it, the American soldiers wanted to be there. And I don't think they went back. In fact, I know some of those companies which had been withdrawn actually got themselves onto the battlefield in battlefield clearance and prisoner of war collection mode during the course of the 4th of July. There were American troops at each level, in other words, battalion headquarters staff with the Australian battalion headquarters staff, medical platoon people with the medical platoon, Australian medical platoons, and so on, across the board. We talk 800 soldiers. My suggestion, if you add the engineers who are already there, you're probably talking about 1,500 Americans were actually involved on that first day of Hangover. And so that's quite a significant input. And we have this guy. Some friends and I, and Ron might be aware of this, that we've met American tourists on the battlefields of France. And we enjoy telling them that the first American Congressional Medal of Honour was awarded to an American corporal serving under Australian command of Hamilton. This is Corporal Pope. Incidentally, if you want to read what he really did, you need to read the Australian recommendation for his action, not the American recommendation, which is all bullshit. Because it talks about him working with tanks and things like that. What Pope did was, at night, after the battle was concluded, the Germans counter-attacked, had pushed into the Australian lines, and Pope went forward with a machine and basically took out several German machine guns and helped drive the German attackers back out. So, I make the point, the Americans were useful. The Americans were brave and gallant. If anything, you could accuse them of being too foolhardy and gallant in terms of gallantry. The Americans, if you look at all the diary entries, valued the Australians and the Brits, saying these were gallant soldiers, these were gallant actions. And sometimes they attribute what was a mild criticism by Monash as congratulations. Monash says, these people are so, particularly about Hindenburg, these people are so gallant that even though they should have stopped, they kept going on with the Australians, and we couldn't stop them, we couldn't get them out of the Australian units. That's a criticism, but the Americans accept that as a great congratulations that we've done that. Just very quickly, following that for 6 weeks, from July, the American 65th Brigade came down and joined the Australians, spread throughout the Australian Corps in frontline duties, took over the machine guns, all that sort of stuff. And then were very reluctant. They had to be literally dragged out when Amiens was about to start, and they were told they couldn't be part of it, and they were very pissed off, to put it mildly, that they were not allowed to be part of the Battle of Amiens. So we come to Amiens, and you'll all be familiar with this. This is the Australian Corps, and the problem area is this area north of the river. Chipperley Spur. And that really became the boundary between the Australian Corps and 3 Corps. But the critical mission for 3 Corps was to secure Chipperley Spur and protect the front of the Australian Corps going through. They failed to do that. I haven't gone to the 3 Corps well enough to say comprehensively, but I'd suggest the Corps Commander was not up to it. During the course of that battle, 33rd US Division was a reserve for 3 Corps, and one of its regiments, the 131st Regiment, was called forward to be involved behind 58th British Division, tackling the spur. Without going too much into it, some of you may have heard of the boy's own story of 6 Australians who went in behind the German lines at Chipperley Spur and actually guided the Americans and the British units through, and were actually credited with capturing over 80 German prisoners on their own. That was a senior NCO, a Lewis gun and 5 privates. The NCO got promoted to officer status. They'd only gone over to actually collect some souvenirs because there was nothing else going on, and found that there was no one there, and basically met up with the Brits and said, "You guys are part of this war, or how about you come with us and we'll show you where to go." It's a great story. No one's trying to do it. If it had been American, there would have been a feature movie.
I've been up on Chipperley Spur, and you can understand what a threat it was, because you can see right down, you can see traffic going along the Roman Road, but you can see right from Chipperley Spur to the bottom of your slide, and you can fire on an enemy there.
And to make matters worse, the commander of 3 Corps had refused to allow Australian artillery to fire into his area. And late in the day, the Australian LA with 58th Division finally got on the 40th and said, "Look, the divisional commander has said, don't give a stuff what the Corps commander is saying. I want artillery on the gun positions at the back there now." To which the Australian said, "Thank God for that," and proceeded to a blanche. So, Monash had wanted that area, and in this case, John and I have had an argument about this, but in this case he's absolutely correct. He should have had that area, because 3 Corps couldn't understand what its mission really was. Okay, so what we do is we create effectively a 6th Australian Division for 2 weeks. And it's called the Liaison Force, sometimes called Wisdom Force after its commander. How you deal with the problem of Chipperley Spur? You take the 131st Infantry Regiment, US 33rd Division, and take it from 3 Corps, give it to the Australians. You give the problem to Monash, and he creates the Liaison Force, 133rd Regiment plus 13 Brigade from 4 Div, which is not in the fight. You put 2nd Brigade headquarters in. You augment 2nd Brigade headquarters. In fact, one of the staff officers coming from the Australian Corps is one Major R.G. Casey, later Governor General of Australia. And you basically take the artillery from 58th British Division and you give that to the Liaison Force, and you bring 132nd US Infantry Division across to replace 13 Brigade as the reserve brigade of 4 Div. So the whole of 66 Brigade are brought in and handed to Monash, but not the brigade headquarters. And here's the gentleman who's running it, Brigadier General Evan Wisdom, and runs it very competently for about 10 days before it's basically the 3rd Australian Division moves in and takes over. Of course, the Americans are starting to say, hang on, you were supposed to send us 33 Division, why is it still bound up with the Australians? We're all thieves. Okay, so what I've done here is really a sketch map. You can see roughly what happens. You can see that we've got now a new boundary. Incidentally, I noticed that Lt-Col in his work criticises Monash for changing his boundaries. If anyone's not aware, boundaries are something that changes all the time. You you get something and some sir says, I want you to do this, and you say, right, I need a new batch of resources to do that, and you change the boundaries or you contract the boundaries, whatever is happening. And we see that on the Hindenburg line. Some writers can't understand what that means. And so what we end up with the Australian Corps advancing with 4 divisions up, which is a pretty significant advance, because there are 2 divisions in the reserve. And you see there you've got at the top 3D, which is in this, you've got, where are we? 24, and then the 32nd British Division is assigned to the Australian Corps, and then at the bottom we've got the 4th Australian, sorry, that's the 1st Division, 4th Division here. It's going to take us through until we get basically to the Monson Queen operation. And then we get the final 2 operations which involve the Americans, which will give us the 27th and 30th Divisions. And I want to draw your attention to this before we start. The Director of General Training, Major General Sir Charles Bonham Carter, incidentally related to the actress Helena Bonham Carter. My work with the Americans is now practically finished. The most backward of divisions is now with us. It's nearly fit to stand on its own feet and walk with it. And after that, Pershing said, I don't mind if you use these divisions because that's the agreement, but I'd like to see them have at least a month's training on a quiet theatre, quiet part of the front, which they get in the Mount Kemmel area. Both divisions get to undertake a divisional advance against retreating Germans. So they've actually had a chance to shake their legs out and do a divisional assault. So we look at the situation. They've trained in America, they've trained under British auspices from May through to beginning of September. They've had 4 weeks roughly in the trenches, a divisional operation that they've done, and they've now arrived under Monash's command. A lot more training and a lot more experience than the Australian divisions had before they went on to Gallipoli. So when we say they're untrained, you've got to set that against what's going on. It's become a bit of a fad by Australian historians. By the way, mention on Hamel very quickly. On the 4th of July 2018, a British historian by the name of Jonathan Boff, who was actually a lecturer at the British Staff College, tweeted that on this day in 1918, the Australian General John Monash captured the inconsequential village of Hamel and therefore won the First World War, which is complete misunderstanding of what Hamel is. But what really appalled me was that an Australian senior historian at the Australian War Memorial also tweeted back, "You also invented women's stockings and sliced bread." This is the state of the way we're thinking about these First World War people. And these guys are actually doing it under appalling conditions of mud and rain and people firing gas at them and people firing shots at them, even the generals, and we're being very twee about it. Okay, we now look at very quickly these general. Here we have General John O'Ryan, later New York Police Commissioner, the only National Guard General, the only reservist to command a division throughout the war. He has attended Staff College. Okay? And of course, Staff College has been taught that open warfare is the thing. You don't worry about machine guns and artillery. We'll explain some things in a minute. Okay. General Lewis, commanding the 30th Division, is a regular, American irregular, good hand. You would say, both. Orion's quite young. Lewis is probably oldish. And now remember that within this formation we're getting, we've got people in the American Army who fought Geronimo. Right? Now, we often think, oh yes, looking at that, you've got to think these people were fighting on the frontier wars with American Indians. Some of them were, they were fighting in Cuba, they were fighting on the Mexican border against Sevilla. Okay, so they're the background, that's the context. Here we have the American soldier using the Lewis gun, which of course most Americans would accept as much better than the French rubbish that they got.
Except it has no magazine.
Yeah, I noticed, I'm not sure, there's one or two things. Either it's a posed photo, or B, his number 2, which you can see there, has actually got the magazine off and is changing the magazine. And it's taken at that point. I'm inclined to go for the latter. I thought as you, that it was probably a posed photo, but the more I think about it, the more I think it's an action photo, and they're actually in the process of changing magazines. But who would know? I mean, whichever, you know, that's what pictures do to you. You know, you worry about what the picture is. Here are the 3 senior people, Pershing in the middle. On his left is General George Reed, commanding the US 2nd Corps. On his right is Colonel Simons, who hated the British with a passion and didn't think he should have to be there. Incidentally, one of the staff officers in this division is a bloke by the name of Major Wainwright, Matthew Wainwright. They ring any bells? American commander in the Philippines in 1941-42. So it all links in.
And Colonel George Marshall.
And Colonel George Marshall and Captain George Patton, not here with these people though. Okay, here are the British senior command. A, of course, on the left, General Sir Henry Rawlinson, known as Rawley the Fox. And on the right, we have General Archibald Montgomery. No relation to Monty, but is the Chief of Staff, or what they called in those days the MGGS, the Major General and General Staff of 4th Army. Interesting, he changes his name to Montgomery Amassingbird during the 1930s, so he can inherit an estate. That was quite common. You know, your second cousin twice removed leaves stuff to you on the understanding that you change your name to his name, or her name, or whatever it happened to be. Big claim to fame, did not command a single formation or unit during the First World War. Alright? I'm building up your story here. In the 1930s, becomes the first Chief of Staff of the British Army, Chief of the Imperial General Staff of the British Army, who had not commanded in the First World War. Was promoted Field Marshal. Now, if you listen to anyone around Australia, they'd say that's impossible because you've actually got to have commanded an army in the First World War to be made Field Marshal. No, Field Marshal. After about 2 years, he was invited to retire, medical retirement, go or be pushed. Yeah, he's a weird guy. He somehow thought that tanks were important. And he kept pushing this idea that we should be doing some tank development, and the British government sacked him, basically got rid of him. Because clearly it was his successor was Cyril Deverell, often regarded as the best British division commander in World War I. Promoted Field Marshal, sacked after 18 months, because he actually went one step further. He said, the next war will be in Europe, it will be within 10 years, and we need those tanks, we need them now, we need a lot of them. And the British Minister of War sacked him. He said, you are disloyal. The Prime Minister has said there will be no war in Europe in the next 10 years. Your job is imperial policing, you don't need tanks for that. 3 years later, guess what happens? And not only that, all the historians have brought the political line that it was the military's fault that they didn't have tanks in the Second World War. We had 3 chiefs of the Imperial General Staff who all in their own way attempted to do something about it, all were blocked by the politicians. I shudder when I see I think about the current defence review in those sort of terms. Okay, so we see that the American soldier is being trained here with tanks. We're going to talk about the Hindenburg outpost line. Now, 3 Corps was supposed to capture each section of the Hindenburg outpost line. The Australians did it in 1 day. All right, yes, I'll give 3 Corps the thing that he had a lot of tough nuts to crack. Australians did it in 1 day, 18th of September. 9 Corps on our right flank took a bit longer. They took another 3 days and needed Australian artillery support to get their section of the Hindenburg outpost line. 3 Corps failed. 3 Corps refused to accept Australian help, refused any additional help like they were offered in another division, and the 3 Corps commander said he didn't think that would make any difference. And then right at the last minute he asked Monash for assistance to take over 500 metres of front. Monash sent the 1st Brigade in to do it, and that's where the mutinies take place. Why? Not because they didn't want to do it, but because they argued that 3 Corps had been swinging in lead all the way through from Amiens and they were tired of it. The Australian 1st Battalion went in with 10 officers and 84 other ranks and captured 500 metres of ground on about a 200 or 300 metre front. Which is really extraordinary to think about it. Now, less than a company is actually managing to do a battalion's worth of. So 3 Corps failed, and the British military historian Sir James Edmonds says 3 Corps did not try. I don't think I've seen a much more powerful criticism of the formation than that. 3 Corps did not try. And that meant, well, hang on, Monash has done all his planning already for the Hindenburg line, but his planning is for a start line which is 1,000 yards in front of where he is. So, Robinson says not to worry. Robinson says, no, don't worry, use 27th Division to. But Monash said, hang on, they've got to do the actual assault. Doesn't matter. So, both Haig and Monash were against it. Robinson stood firm and said, no, 3 Corps are hopeless. No, any brigade will be able to do that. But of course, who gets the blame for the failure there? Monash, as you do. 27th Division fails. One of the problems is that there's a British minefield there that the British haven't marked. Now, the Germans do mark it, but when you're in a tank, it's very difficult to see small signs that says, no, mine and verboten, etc. And because 27th Division doesn't hold the ground, no one knows where this minefield is or even what's caused the tanks to be. No one's identified what the problem is. So that's going to be a lovely little surprise for everybody on the actual day. There's an unmarked British minefield, and more importantly, they've attacked. They probably got up close to where they should have got, but they couldn't hold it. And now there are Americans sitting out there. Now, Monash wanted to spend 2 days shelling the area before they went in. Several, not only for destructive reasons, but to stop the Germans being fed. His argument was if you stop the Germans being fed, they are not going to be terribly interested on the morning you actually attack them, if they are without food and water for 2 or 3 days. So what happens now? The American commander and General Robinson agree that they will not use artillery whatsoever in that first 1,000 yards. I would suggest that Orion is partly making a decision on the basis that American soldiers do not need artillery. That baggage is still, intellectual baggage is still with him when he's making that decision. So, no artillery in the first 1,000 yards? Great, okay. So what we end up with, have a look at this. This is where the start line should be for the Hindenburg line. Okay? This is where it actually is, the dark line there. 30th Division is pretty close to its start line. It's not a real issue. At worst, they're 150, 200 metres away in some places, but in general, they're actually in front of it. 27th Division is 1,000 yards behind. Now, we should meet the person that's causing all the drama. General August Max von Bern. Any of us here who are somewhat of the mature years, this guy is the person who offers us hope. He's 68 years of age at the Hindenburg Line. He's retired originally as a 3-star general in 1913. He's brought back when the war starts and given basically vital asset protection duties. But by this stage of the war, he's the go-to guy. You have a nasty problem, you send, who do you send for? You send for Max. And he's the sort who is going to make life very difficult for everybody. Bear in mind, the British intelligence is saying, of the 6 divisions facing you, only 2 can be described as first-class divisions. 4, now some of the others are simply 4th-class trench divisions only. Theoretically, it should be a walkover, but it's not, because the Germans have developed some tactics to stop it. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the original, Monash's plans for the Hindenburg Line. We're running out of time dramatically here, sorry. Right, 2 divisions up front, the Americans first. Why? Yes, it's difficult, but you can control it because you know where the boundaries are. You can support them at that first thing. The Australian division, we're going to move through, move across open ground with open flanks and an objective line where the divisions are actually going out 1,000 yards. In other words, you start on, you come through on a 7,000 yard front and you're going to go out to about 8,500 yards by the time you hit the line in phase 2. In the phase 1, you're going to send a light armoured column through to attack the Germans, and in phase 2, the Australians will move through, the Americans will swing to the right to provide some basic protection. Finally, the 2nd Australian Division, the 5th Cavalry Brigade, will provide a force to exploit the following day, the 30th. Okay, so what we're going to look like is roughly this. So the first phase is what's happening here. The American divisions are going up here and swinging like that. The Australians are coming up and having to spin out to take Beaurevoir and Montbraham. And between the phases, here we have this armoured column with 15 vehicles, 7 armoured cars, 8 equipped tanks. Now this is a repeat of what happens at Amiens, except this time it's a bit more ambitious. So they're going to drive 20 kilometres deep into the German lines. They're going to destroy German rail junctions. It's fairly important. We should also very quickly think about either side of the Australian assault, which is the St Quentin Canal. Here it is, and the British 46th Division is going to cross there. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't think about what was regarded as the forlorn hope. 46th Division, again commanded by a divisional commander who had risen from private to Major General, and the 46th Division crossed successfully. But the Australians needed to take their section because obviously you're not going to get tanks across that, and the 46th Division was going to get its tanks once the Australians captured the top of the Hindenburg Line. Okay, and you can see there where the start line is going to be for this assault. And this area here is a problem because you're not going to shell it, which means the Germans can, basically play wicky-wacky and waikiki because no one's going to shoot at them while they're reinforcing that area. And this is the ace and hole for the Germans. They're building up anti-tank positions. 3 or 4 of these, which are 13mm Mauser anti-tank rifles, will punch through a Mark 5. And they're supporting this, which is a dug-in 77mm gun in a direct fire roll. And the whole thing is also being keyed into the German artillery, right, which is coming over the top and is supported by multiple machine gun nests. And we see repeatedly, machine gunners are elite troops. You might have a 4th class division there, but you put in these people in between, and you've got a real problem. So that by the end of the first day, we end up like this. 22nd Division goes and go too far. And 30th, basically, while it falls apart, basically achieves its own. And as I said, if you go to Rick Valley, you'll find a obelisk there that says the 30th Division successfully managed to capture the Hindenburg line, and it's a fair comment. It doesn't mention the number of stragglers they had and all that sort of problem, and the fact that it fell apart. So, by this stage, it has one regiment reduced to a provisional battalion because it's lost all the rest on its assault there. Monash didn't want to do that. Monash wanted to take them from where they were and go the whole division on that morning. Instead of which they fretted away basically brigades worth of soldiers. No artillery used in the first 1,000 yards. 301st Heavy Tank Battalion, that's 34 Mark 5s and Mark 5 stars. 6 additional tanks provided from 4th Tank Battalion for the first section. Now, there's no divisional plan ever issued for that first section. Why? I wondered about this because there's no plan for it, and when you read the divisional commander, he's not worried about the length of the assault. Why? Because he doesn't think he's going to have to do it. What he's worried about is the breadth. Why? Because he doesn't have enough bayonets to man the whole front. Remember, he's going to, the soldier is what's important. Bayonets in the front line is what's important. The idea of Monash of fire teams working forward that's not something the Americans have got themselves across at this point in the war. And two things. 2:10 p.m, the afternoon before the assault, Australian Corps Headquarters sends a message to 27th Division saying, this is the situation, what you guys need to do is to kick off an hour before the actual assault starts. Right? So that you are up to the actual start line when the assault, when all the artillery starts. So you can then hug the artillery forward. To do that, we're going to give you 6 additional tanks. And, next point, make sure your infantry stay with the tanks. So, what happens? At 4:50, all the tanks are sent off without any infantry support. An hour later, the infantry start. Why? Because at 6 p.m. the evening before, the regimental commander at the front signals his div headquarters and says, we've worked forward during the night or during the afternoon, and we're within about 200, 300 metres of the start line, and I think we can do it by tomorrow morning. So, Orion says, beauty, don't have to do anything. And he plans to let the guys do that, and of course during the night they're actually all pushed back to the original start line. That's why, if you're starting an hour after Sir says you've got to start, I think you've got a problem before even the kick-off. And this is one of the problems they meet. This is the British minefield, but no one's while the Germans have marked it from an infantry point of view, you're not going to see that from a tank. And it's foggy, it's smoky, and you're going to run into it before you realise what's going on. And then, to make matters worse, we have the armoured column. Believe it or not, the crews of both these vehicles got out uninjured. Some were captured, but they got out uninjured. The armoured commander from 17 Armoured Car Battalion wrote that he'd been told by the Americans the way was clear. We own the village of Boney, get going. He said, we came across the first couple of trenches and we took them out with our machine guns. He said that by the time we got up near the village, it was clear the Americans were not in the village, the Germans were, and we were taking a lot of shell fire, a lot of, our vehicles were being knocked out. He said, I withdrew down the hill to a safe as possible place, set ourselves up and hold down fire positions. The Australian infantry came up behind us and together we established a battle line. The Americans had no concept of grabbing a battle line. Now, you went forward as far as you could. If you couldn't go any further, you stopped and you dug in and you tied in your machine guns to the unit alongside. The Americans at Hamel were very, very amazed at the cross. They said the Australian units talk to each other across the front. They know what's going on in the next company or the next battalion. He said, contrast that with the American operation on the 27th, the outpost line, where the commander of the 105th regiment, who was supposed to be supporting the 106th, simply withdrew his battalion because he decided it was too dangerous. He didn't bother to tell the 106th regimental commander or divisional headquarters that he was pulling out. You know, that's inconceivable in an Australian situation. Okay, so a lot of failure. So problems. Some troops did reach the objectives, such as the Knoll, and the Knoll was repeatedly captured and lost during the day, but they were unable to cope with fog and smoke. It will appear from American debriefs, the NCOs did not bother to carry compasses with them. They somehow thought that it was unnecessary and undignified to be carrying a compass to march on a bearing. So, you've got units going like this over the battlefield, missing positions, in some places support units suddenly found themselves having to take out positions. It was a chaos out there. And you had straggling. It would appear from American, no one knew where the straggle posts were. It was the Australian divisions who were picking up American stragglers. Clearly differences of tactical philosophy. Even afterwards, the American Corps commander said, what I think we Americans need to look at is the Australian ability at regimental and battalion level to actually fight the battle. He said, our commanders are not fighting the battle, we're just going forward. And you contrast that with, say, 40th Battalion Colonel Lord comes up, strikes a problem, hang on, I'll go and find a tank. So he goes and finds a tank and then he gets his battalion moving again. Pompey Elliott, 2 days later, looks at the situation and said, we're not going head on in this, so he holds with 2 battalions, sends a 3rd battalion around through another brigade and assaults up the side. His battalion commanders come back to him and said, okay, I've not gone where you told me to go, I could go further, and to which Elliott comes back and said, for God's sake, if you can go further now. You don't get that sort of hands-on by American regimental and brigade commanders. It's sit back and wait for the thing to happen. One of the classic stories is this gentleman here, Hubert Wilkins, polar explorer, etc. He's only a photographer, right? It's just only a photographer. He ends the war with an MC and bar, right? And it's pretty difficult for a non-arms officer to get an MC to start with. He's got 2. And one of them comes from this one. You can see he's on a knocked out tank in the minefield there. He's come forward to set up his cameras to photograph the 3rd Division coming up. What does he find? He finds a trench with about 200 Americans all cleaning their weapons. Are you guys part of this war? Yeah, but there's no one here to tell us. Why? Well, the officers have been killed, they've gone away, there weren't officers to start with. The average American battalion has 18 officers at full strength. The average Australian battalion has 40. There's an issue for starters. So Wilkins jumps in and takes command of these Americans and said, right, this is what we're going to do. He gets one of his NCOs, possibly the guy here, gets the machine gun and they take out an attacking group of Germans. He gets hold of it. And we get that repeatedly. Now, of Australians coming up, quite minor Australians, finding a group of Americans standing around saying they're quite happy to be shot at, but they've got no leadership. Blair Walk, who's a major commander at that stage, commanding 32nd Battalion, finds 200 Americans wandering about and says, you people better join me. Another battalion commander finds an American machine gun platoon, completely lost. So he adds them to his. Now, being Australian, of course, acquires 4 Vickers guns, no problem at all. and doesn't give them back for another 3 or 4 days. I mean, I was a battalion commander. I had a chance of grabbing 4 Vickers guns. I'd be doing that, no problem at all. And that's in both divisions. We've got this fragmentation, lack of leadership, lack of command and control. They're enthusiastic, the basic product is great, they do great, valiant things, but at this macro level of the brigade and division, they're all over the shop. But it's Monash's fault. Pretty much see that now. So what do the Americans think about it? If we're saying the Australians should never have had these Americans, the Americans are there because the British aren't prepared. British aren't prepared to chance their divisions because Haig's been told if you lose too many people, I'm going to sack you. See how the politics is driving? The British politics drives the resource allocation, which in turn drives the fact that the Americans are with the Australians. It's not Monash's problem, and it's a problem which starts in Downing Street. Very quickly, you can see this is what John O'Ryan says. The officers of these divisions sought the opportunity to fight. They were full of confidence. In reference to discussions whether the Americans should have been used at all, while such speculations have been referred to, are perhaps interesting, they have no particular value. The battle had to be fought, we fought the battle, good or bad. And that's it. So what's the aftermath? Well, sometimes I think we forget that combat ain't Alice in Wonderland. Quote by Joseph L. Galloway Jr. It's wonderful to listen to on YouTube. Alliances bring obligations. Australians should remember that. We assume that AUKUS and ANZUS will always work the way we want it to work. We will never be asked by the Americans to do jobs which we don't think we should be doing. Alliances bring obligations. Interoperability, interchangeability are not just words. You may not have the same equipment, you may not have the same organisation, but you have to be able to talk the same language and do the same job. Two allies can be separated by a common language. And finally, if I just finish off very quickly, Australian mounted and artillery units remained in support of the American 2nd Corps until the 14th of October. That is nearly 10 days after the Australian Corps had withdrawn from the line. And as I said, this has been a bit long, but only really a skate over the target. I've written 3 papers on this, which you can find on the RUSI website under the Javelin monograph collection. There'll be more coming later in the year. You don't just churn them out as you feel like it. But anyway, there we go. Okay, it's been a bit of a bum rush. Sorry, Rob, I've taken more time than necessary. But I think some of this is very important for us to consider even today, not just on how we look at the past, but how we're looking at the current situation of China and our alliances today. If you're the junior partner, sometimes you get the shit jobs. And you can't pick and choose. Okay? I'll leave it there for any questions. We've had some